Results of that is in a recent Gallup poll, over 50% of Americans polled, when asked, what do you like about Islam? Or what do you admire about Islam? Over 50%, in fact the majority, almost 40%, said nothing. And the others said, I don't know. That's over 50% of people in this country. Now, about 35% said, I like their devotion to their religion, which is good. I mean, that's a good, but that's a small number of people. If you have over 50% of people that have nothing to admire about Islam, that is because these people have been effective in delivering their message, and we have been completely ineffective in delivering our message. One of the major problems with the Muslim community today is that we're constantly defining ourselves by what we are not. We don't tell people who we are, we tell them who we're not. And Islam, in many ways, becomes a player in identity politics. There are Muslims that define themselves vis-a-vis the kafir. I'm not a kafir. Even though they're not practicing Islam in any serious way, just the mere fact that they're not a kafir puts them in this special category, the chosen people category. You see, so that's a problem. But then we're not constantly telling people we're not terrorists, we're not this, we're not that. Well, when you're under siege, defense is a natural response. So we have a very serious problem in this country, and believe it or not, the problem is worse in Western Europe. So if you think it's bad here, it's worse in Western Europe. It's in France, in Belgium. They're now having tests in Germany where the homophobic tests for Muslims, if you don't pass them, they're not going to give you residency, to see how whether or not how you feel about homosexuality, how you feel about this, that, or the other. I mean, these are realities. So we're moving into this inquisitorial period where people, their basic patriotism is challenged, you see, and there's a big difference between patriotism and nationalism. Patriotism is love of your country for its good, and recognizing also that you have an obligation to change the things that are wrong about your country. Nationalism is just blind belief in your country, where you're not looking at with any balance. That's not patriotism, which is why patriotism is the last refuge of a scoundrel. People will cling to patriotism. One of the things in this country, our community has failed, and I include myself in this, and I'm sure Imam Siraj and others, I don't want to speak for them, but I think I know him well enough to say this, that in previous periods, when I first started speaking in the early 90s, and that our discourse was not balanced. There's people that say, oh, well, you've changed. But if you see a tree when it's young, when it's just sprouting out, and then you come back years later and the tree is full grown, or it looks different. It's not the same. You could say it changed, but that's a natural evolution of a tree. If you're staying the same, something's wrong. You're not alive. You're dead. You shouldn't be saying the same. You should be growing. But the point is that our discourse was not balanced. We were focusing so often on what was negative about this country that our discourse was not balanced, and we ended up alienating some people. People would come to talks and they would hear something and they would be alienated by that talk. And that's why it's not a spin when you change that discourse. It's not for spin. It should be based on principle, because Muslims are principled people. And the Prophet ﷺ, for instance, I have in the early period, I've said things about other religions that I regret now, not because of spin, but because I don't believe that they were Islamically sanctioned statements. I don't believe that. I really, truly do not believe that. I think they were incorrect. And I can't stand on that. You have to recognize what's true and what's not true in your discourse. And if we don't do that, one, we're denigrating our own religion, because we're not being true representatives of our religion. It's absolutely important to do that. On the other hand, again, we are under siege as a community. And so we have to respond to the circumstances that we find ourselves in this country. We now must educate people in this country. We have to. We have to tell them who we are. We have to tell them who we are, not just for our sake, but for their sake. One of the things about these books, I was with a friend of mine, Dr. Hatem Bazayan, and we were with a man named Chris Hedges. I don't know if people know him, but Chris Hedges wrote War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning, and he wrote Losing Moses on the Freeway, the Ten Commandments in America. He's somebody who studied theology at Harvard University, and he became a war correspondent for the New York Times. He worked 20 years corresponding in combat conditions, writing newspaper articles for the New York Times. During that time, he was in 15 wars. 15 wars. He's seen wars all over. He was in 7 years in the Arab world. He knows Palestine very inside out. And he studied Arabic. He's a very interesting man. But he was there with us, and I told Hatem Bazayan, I said, congratulations. He said, about what? I said, I was reading the book, The 100 Most Dangerous Professors in America, and I saw you got you were in there. I think he's number 65 or something. So I was telling him, congratulations. And when I said that, I was being a little facetious, but when I said that, Chris Hedges said, those books are very dangerous. You know, and he was actually really upset about it. These books like these, you can laugh them off, but they're very dangerous because these books are on the front in Barnes & Noble, in Borders. People come and they buy that. They trust the information. They think they're getting sound information. And these people are liars. They're fabricators of truth. They distort reality. And this is wrong to do that, because what Chris Hedges said is that in every single war he covered, he said there was always a discourse of hatred that began before the war, that set the stage for that war. And he said the same thing is happening in this country. The same thing is happening in this country. And his book now is on the religious right of this country, because he's deeply concerned about where this country is headed. And we have to take these things very serious, because, and I've said this before, and Dr. Almar has really reinforced this concept, we are a historical community. We are part of a historical process. We are here for a purpose. We are in the United States of America in large numbers, and we should be utilizing that fact. We have a job to do, and that job is about reconciling, because we don't want a planet that disintegrates into more war, into more hatred, into more violence, into more conflict, into more human suffering. We don't want that. I don't want that for my children. I have 5 boys. I don't want that for my children. I don't want them to ever have to witness carpet bombing. I don't ever want them to be at the end of some type of weapon of mass destruction, or see children blown up. I don't want them to see that. And anybody that wants war is a warmonger.
And our Prophet ﷺ was a prophet of peace. He came to bring peace. He did not come, he came in the midst of immense cycles of violence in the Arabian Peninsula. And he ended those cycles of violence. He ended those cycles of violence. He did not generate them. He ended them. And that was part of his historical role, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He was a prophet of peace as much as Jesus was a prophet of peace. As much as any prophet that's coming, because they call to peace. They call to salam. And that's what the Prophet said after every prayer. Give me peace. Let me live in peace. Let me die in peace. Oh, giver of peace. This is the Prophet's prayer. The Quran says, كُلَّمَا أَوْقَدَ نَارًا لِلْحَرِّ أَطْفَأَهَا اللَّهُ. Every time they attempted to flame, to inflame the war, put fire on the fuel of war, God put those flames out. Allah is muqfi al-harb. That is an attribute that Allah describes Himself with in the Quran, that He puts out war. So we can imagine how much greater would be the human suffering if Allah didn't stop so much of this harm. So we as a community have a historical